I'm going to be a bit of a player coach. I'm going to, in terms of moderator panelist, this is about political campaigns, advocacy campaigns. How can you engage with First Nations for your campaign? And I'll just quickly introduce the panelists. First of all, I'll introduce myself, Michael, as a panelist member. I started Modern Miracle Network. We did a campaign to engage with First Nations on energy development that we started in 2015, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what 2015, 2016. When I get a chance, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did in that campaign, and I think it's been extraordinary to go from oil and gas in Canada is the dirtiest in the world, and oil and gas companies do nothing but exploit First Nations who are just trying to protect their land from our greedy capitalists like us, to Canada's the best in the world at oil and gas, and if respectfully involved, First Nations actually are in favor of development. So that's been a major change, and a lot of it's been related to the campaign that we did, so I want to talk a little about that. And then I'll just go across the panel, or I'll start at the end. So Chief Duke Pelche is from Manitoulin Island, and he is here yesterday on a panel to talk about commonality of interests from First Nations principles to conservative principles, and we're going to pick up on some of that again today. But if it wasn't said yesterday, why you should be interested in engaging with people like Duke and his people is that they are clever enough about campaigns to get a $10 billion settlement, and I think at least over $1 billion just to your nation. So I think incredible experience with campaigning, right? Alexandria is a geoscientist, geophysicist by background, but many of us in this room know her as one of the founders of Energy Minute, which I think was an innovative social media group that had a good impact, and now has moved on to doing some. I think you still do a little bit with Energy Minute, right? Or are you complete? Anyways, you're
Yes.
Now onto First Nations engagement and stuff. So we're going to have Alexandria talk about those experiences, and then Malcolm McPherson is he's got Mi'kmaq ancestry from Quebec, currently in Vancouver, and has an interesting legal practice that is 100% First Nations bands, and so does nothing but represent that side of things. It turns out a lot of the big firms all have conflicts, but he doesn't, because he doesn't have to worry about working for governments, etc. Okay, so
they're the targets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not industry, but the government.
Yeah, get the government. Okay, so I guess going to sort of start off with a bit of an opening, and Alexandria, I know that you had some sort of overall thoughts. So I'm gonna ask you if you can just sort of give that that overall high-level approach, if you wanted to engage with First Nations to join you in whatever your interest or your campaign or your issue is. What are your sort of high-level thoughts on how you make that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you folks here. I mean, the classic formula, I have 3 key messages, and the first is to be brave, and then the second would be there are no shortcuts. I think folks in here are very comfortable doing the work, and I would love for that message to resonate. And then the last would be to hire an expert.
What would be your high-level thoughts on how to do it? Alexandria talked about is that engagement.
Sure. Well, really liked Alexandria's is it your grandfather's advice? Go slow to go fast, and so.
Okay, a really good moderator never asks a question that they don't know the answer to. But we only just met, and what I do know from last night is you know some good jokes. But I'm going to ask a question that I don't know what your answer is going to be. So I hope that's going to work out fine. And I'll just start with an example. Jason Kenney was not just the Minister of Immigration; he was also the Alberta caucus leader, Southern Alberta caucus leader in Alberta, so Calgary, the center of Calgary's oil and gas industry. And he likes to say to people, I was in power for 9.5 years. I want you to guess how many oil and gas companies came to Ottawa and engaged me on helping with their issue. And the answer is 0, not 1. So my question to you is, how many people have come to you in your community to say, hey, could we engage with you on helping to work together on an issue? How many people have done that?
Well, thank you, Michael, for the question. I think one of the one of the biggest things is that many communities are in their infancy in actually joint venturing, having partners, building relationships.
Okay, I'm going to just take something from Stephen Rowe's presentation into the why. Like, why would we want to do this? And I think that things like I have a cement plant and I need to get some water pumped in out of my company, or I need to get a project. I think we all understand I need to form a joint venture. There's a corporate reason. But for this crowd of political activists, like what we did at MMN said, well, we want to now go from the micro, how do we cooperate on a project, to the macro, how do we align in from both a cultural narrative and political goal of changing legislation, changing policies with that macro level. And Jean Charest came out and did a speech. Jean Charest is a genius of what I call receiver-based communication. He comes out to Albertan, man, he's a Quebecer that can speak Albertan, right? But what he does such a great job of, this is why Albertans are right about this, and this is why Albertans are smart about this, but then he just manages to slide at the end of his speeches. But you have to realize, in Canadian politics, First Nations is like the trump card. So you do have to find a way to engage with them. And this was talking about, our policy problems, right? So what I want to talk a little bit about is some of the places where there might be common ground for people in this crowd. And I'm just going to throw out things like people's point of view on crime, on social conservative issues, on free drug sites, on parental rights, resource development. Is there any examples where people have ever tried to work with you on something like that?
Well, I guess part of the relationship building that we've undertaken is having, as I said, one of the companies that wanted to establish or reestablish the coring operation in collaboration with us, with our community.
Okay, I'll go to Malcolm next to sort of ask a similar question, but I'll just give the example. Instead of me wanting to get somebody to make a business deal with me and how do I work with the First Nation, instead I want these First Nations leaders to stand up on the stage with me, to be on a panel with me, to be in the media with me on my issue. And I'll just put out one that's a bit obvious, parental rights. First Nations have a lot of experience with what happens when parents lose rights. And so I know there's a lot of potential for alignment there with First Nations. So not necessarily on that issue, but on that type of issue, how would you engage First Nations to stand on the stage with you or in the media with you?
Yeah, no, really, really interesting question. I guess the question is the how. So, well, before I answer the how, just step back and just say that, there is a lot of alignment between, I would say, conservative values and what a number of the nations want to see happen. And I would say, my lived experience, like I do a lot of work in Saskatchewan.
Okay, I'm going to just go to the bravery thing that you said because it relates to what you just said. And I'm going to give the example for me in Quebec. I was doing business in Quebec since 1993. We made a big discovery in 2008. We're being totally screwed over. You've got to get behind us on this. That's a separate panel. But I can tell you that during that entire time, I was extremely intimidated and nervous and scared to the point that I never really had gone out into the community on the South Shore, like the small towns, because I knew I was unilingual English. I was a cowboy de l'Alberta. They were going to hate me, and I was going to be in with these, the Quebec nationalists and unilingual French people, and this was not going to be a friendly place for me, and I just didn't go. And then, but as I say, because we developed to the moratorium, il n'y avait pas de moratoire, il n'y aurait pas pris le français. And if it hadn't been for the moratorium, it gave me I wasn't any less scared, but I was more motivated. I had to go talk and get local support for the project because it was going the wrong way. What I found was that everybody's saying, hey, if you want to talk to people from Quebec, you have to use somebody who's from Quebec. They have to be a real Quebecer. You can't try to. What I found is they want to talk to decision makers. And they'd rather talk to a unilingual English CEO of a company who is the decision maker than a bilingual Quebecois intermediary who had no actual decision making. It was a real revelation to me. And of course, since then, I've taken time to learn French as well. So now I'm going to just take that experience to, you're saying, well, like I remember the first time I went to a powwow, I was nervous. But just that thought, and maybe I'm going to start with you on this, Duke. So what a lot of people worry about, and I know I still do a bit, but I used to really a lot, is I'm going to make something wrong with ceremony or tradition, or I'll say the wrong thing about residential schools or traditional land rights, or I'll forget what nation or treaty or something, and I'll be out in that boat, and I'll just get pushed into the water, you know? So, so what I guess I'd say from your perspective, when people come out and say, look, I just don't know, what's the right way to get across that sense of intimidation that I'll come out and I'll say the wrong thing?
Well, I have some own personal experience with that. I've in my life, I've gone from leaving the reserve at 17 years old, arriving in just north of Saskatoon in one of the last residential schools that opened, that was still open. So brown faces everywhere, different language, it's Cree language where I went. But I made a choice shortly after that. Within months, I went there to play some hockey. So I ended up down in Regina and Weyburn, Saskatchewan. So I made a decision to play in Weyburn. And anybody that knows southern Saskatchewan, it's completely different from all the brown faces in the residential school environment.
Okay, I'm just going to go from and I get it's a barrier to be brave, but you have to do it if you want to engage, right? So maybe there's no, as you said, no shortcuts. I want just another experience that I thought was so interesting was I managed to meet at the beginning of this MMN campaign so many First Nations leaders in northern BC that were all behind the Gateway Pipeline. There was dozens, right? There's maybe a couple against, but it was dozens for, a whole bunch that hadn't signed but were looking to be about to sign. And then, of course, Trudeau came into power, canceled it. One of the things I thought was just most despicable about that, without so much as a phone call or a letter, like those First Nations leaders who live, many of them live in terrible poverty, destitute, very few economic opportunities in northern BC besides mining, oil, gas pipelines, things like that. And after 5 or 10 years of efforts and time and money and getting community behind it, the whole thing just gets pulled out from underneath them, as I said, without even a phone call. They learn about it in the newspaper, right? And so I was talking to Steve Bell, and I talked to a couple of the chiefs, said, why aren't you out screaming? Like, why aren't you on on the legislature? Like, every time somebody's trying to put a project through your community, you're all out there, you're all through the media. Why aren't we hearing from you? Because, as John Charest said, you're the trump card in Canadian politics. And universally said, because we have no power, we have no voice. And so I want you to react to what I took as a learning from that. First Nations have a big voice on environmental issues because NGOs give them the tribune and they amplify that voice. On the pro-gateway, even today, I don't think the average Canadian knows how those First Nations were so depending on that, and what happened to them when it got taken away, because there was nobody to amplify their voice. And that's when I realized, you know what, we need to join with them and help to amplify their voice. So I want to just get, I guess, your reaction to, do you agree with what I'm saying? Maybe add, why are the NGOs so successful in amplifying First Nations voices? Why are other pro-conservative issues, whether it's parental rights to oil pipelines, whatever, why are we so unsuccessful in amplifying First Nations voices?
Well, I think it's really an understanding on finding who the actual spokesperson is on behalf of whatever the project is.
Okay, we have just about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna do my little panel. I'm gonna switch to panelists for a second. I just want to talk about the campaign that we did, and I see Stuart Mears in the room, and he's got Indigenous Partnership Showcase coming up in June, and he's become a big part of this pro-resource First Nations campaign as well. But I'll tell you where we started with Modern Miracle. When we started it, it was at a time when we were the dirtiest oil in the world. That's what's in there. People in Europe are looking to ban not oil in general. They were looking to ban Canadian oil specifically. And also, the narrative was absolutely that all First Nations were against oil and gas development because they were protecting the land, and oil and gas companies, by implication, of course, didn't care about the land. That was, I think, the dominant narrative across the country, even if not everybody believed it. That was certainly the dominant narrative, right? And so when we went to the campaign, we said, look, how are we going to change this? And I said, well, step one was, let's identify our potential constituencies, who should be on our side. And so I said, well, producers, right? Oil and gas producers, obviously. suppliers, the people that supply us, the rig companies, the steel companies, these kinds of people, like the golden rule says, if we're paying you, you should be supportive, right? So that made sense. Prosperity economics groups, the Fraser Institute, and the different people who cared about economics and prosperity of the country. There's a whole constituency of that. And I thought, well, what about aligned producers? And of course, we had Sherry on the panel yesterday. Well, because that's how I met Sherry, was agriculture, Rick Eckstein, forestry, mining. So I started to meet all these kinds of people who seemed to be easily alignable people, because we had the same issues and problems. And then we also thought, well, possibly customers. It's been interesting, though. You'd think airlines would be a huge advocate for us, but in fact, they're just too busy dealing with their customers, and the golden rule applies the opposite way. They're saying, you got to solve our problem for us. We're not solving it for you, right? So they were less helpful than I thought. And then getting back to Jean Charest's words, I said, there's a must-win constituency for us. If we can't get First Nations to support us, we're going to lose this campaign. But I can tell you at the time, I thought to myself, I don't know that we can win that. Because I believe the dominant narrative that all First Nations were against us. But I said, but I know we have to, right? So I guess that became the bravery thing. And I phoned Tom Flanagan, who's a good friend of mine, who I knew a lot of First Nations. I said, who should I talk to? He told me Steve Buffalo. So I got on the phone with Steve Buffalo, and Steve says, yeah, and he said, because Steve was trying to get this thing going himself. He was trying to get his own conference, Pipeline Gridlock. He's got his own whole stories about how horrible community was to him, how he was betraying his people, betraying the land, but he's had a lot of personal, spiritual even issues with the way he was vilified by his own band and people, right? Anyway, but that was the start of it, and what that really came down to in terms of that campaign was, one was the bravery. I guess you had to make the connection, right? But the second thing was to have the connection, and I said, okay, where's the connection? And it really came down from job sharing. I came up with this thing is job sharing, equity sharing, and revenue sharing, right? And it ultimately came to say we had to switch sides, where the industry had always been behind government, enforcing traditional views of property rights, and of course we took our leases from the government, and so we were looking for the government, us, to enforce our rights to extract that oil and gas from under that land. And I said, politically, why are we with the government against the First Nations when the First Nations should be our partner against the government? And so it was kind of, let's flip sides, be with the First Nations, job sharing, equity sharing, revenue sharing, and tell the government to start doing it and be on their side. So that was the idea, just sort of switch sides. And then, but once we found that, so that's, I'm going through this very quickly, right? But it was like, A, find the connection of somebody that might listen. 2, find the commonality, and part of it was by saying, we want to be on your side now. I know we didn't used to be, but we want to be on your side now. And part of it was, then had to come, then, because the next part then became, how do we establish trust? Because people said, you guys have been against us all this time. Like, as Steve Buffalo says, all your projects, all we ever get is a drive-by. It's just not a drive-by shooting, but a drive-by resource extraction. We get a couple of flag jobs on the highway and you're gone, right? So how do we know it's just not going to be another drive-by? We don't trust you people, right? And so it really had to come down. I said, listen, I get it. Like in grade 10 social studies, they taught me that the treaties extinguish title. The Supreme Court has told me I'm wrong. I get it. That's why I'm on your side now. And I tell these people, I've told them in speeches and in private meetings, so it's self-interest. But you can, I tell you, there is no more sincere form of interest than self-interest. You can trust me. And I tell you, it's worked. People really go, and your point about respect and no paternalism and reciprocity, and just saying, I'm just here to make a deal, and by the way, I got it. You got rights. I was wrong. I've changed my mind. The Supreme Court told me I had to. I'm here out of self-interest. We can do business. It's really worked well. Where that really led to, though, is we had to do a few conferences where we brought First Nations people to speak at. So it took a few years for the, okay, you know what? I think we're starting to trust you really do want to be on our side. And that's what led to our first conference. We got 2 of those chiefs from northern BC, went out and talked to the National Post. That changed everything, because it's the hardest thing is to get the first person to come out and say something. Today, so many First Nations, it just exploded. once the first people came out publicly in the National Post, and Stuart Muir is a great person to talk about how this has just taken on a life of its own. But that's just a quick opportunity, and I think if you have an issue, conservative issue, ours was resource development, but there are others. And if you want to have, whether it's water or economic prosperity, jobs, getting the government out of your life, parental rights, I think you'll find if you're a social conservative, there's a lot of alignment with First Nations and social conservatism. There's a lot of alignment around traditional medicine and not being forced to take vaccines. You'd be surprised how much alignment there is there. And it is the trump card of Canadian politics. If you can get First Nations with you, like we've been able to do on resource development, by trusting that we're working together, then you're going to make your issue go a lot further. So we got about 2 minutes left, and I'm going to let each of you just sort of finish with your wrap-up comments about how do you get how to work with First Nations on campaigns. So I'll let Malcolm, you conclude first.
Okay. Yeah, well, I just wanted, before I conclude, and I'll be brief, I promise. I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment that there's a lot of commonalities, Michael. And you know, it's just because people are people and humans are humans, and you know, that's why capitalism works and socialism does not, right? It's if you align the self-interest and you guide that self-interest, it leads to good outcomes.
How do you expect people in Ontario to speak out for our industry when our own leaders aren't willing to speak out because it's intimidating to speak out? And if you're a CEO of an oil and gas company who speaks out, gets bad publicity, your company takes the hit in the market and all your friends do fine, but they get all the benefit of you speaking out, but none of the cost. So it does take courage for oil and gas leaders to speak out. Good, Mike. Good job, Mike. But I also want to tell you that I would say that while ENGO is vocationally and vicious to me, I wouldn't say my own community has been, but I know that, and I've heard from people like Dale Swampy and Steve Buffalo and other chiefs, and we all should respect it. It might take some bravery to decide to go into community and deal with, be worried about you're going to have make a cultural mistake or something. The bravery it took for people like Duke to speak out is incredible, because they did take, from their own community, they took a lot of criticism. So let's give Duke and the panel a round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you.
And
We just had 2 or 3 more experienced business leaders, CEOs of any industry, who do what Michael does, put their money where their mouth is, invest in the movement, invest to make a difference. This would be a way better country. So thank you, Michael. MMN is a big sponsor of our conference and of today. Michael and Maria as well. So thank you, guys.